Hello, friendly alumni. Welcome back to From Here Forward, an award-winning UBC Podcast Network podcast. I'm Carol.
And I'm Jeevan. We have a very literary episode coming to you all. This month, we sat down with an author that truly needs no introduction, but it's us, so we're going to give it a try anyways.
So today's episode is an especially fun one for us. What you may or may not know about Jeevan and I is that we are both avid readers.
Oh, for sure. Top tier hobby of mine. Carol, I'm curious, how would you describe your go-to read? What kinds of books do you often return to? Like, take me on a journey here. Paint me a picture.
Broken families, sadness, heartbreak, grief, longing. You know, the very light reading genres. The more sad it is, the more likely I'm going to want to read it over and over again. And I am one of those people that judges a book by its cover, but specifically the title. If the title suggests that it's gonna be something really sad and heartbreaking, maybe depressing, I'll be there. What about you?
First of all, I have never been less surprised in my life by an answer, so thank you for that. I actually read a lot of speculative fiction. I typically gravitate towards South Asian writers. I dabble in romance every now and again, but it's got to be a really specific vibe for it to stick for me, you know? They got to really, really execute it well.
What is this specific vibe in romance? I really love a miscommunication trope. When the adults don't communicate, and then there's all this misunderstanding that goes on for years and years and years. Chef's kiss.
I think not too much romance. It was really fun for Carol and I to nerd out about writing and books. And so, without further ado,
we talked to Loghan Paylor, a writer and UBC MFA in creative writing alum. Logan's first book, The Cure for Drowning, peep that very sad title, won CBC's Canada Reads this year.
The Cure for Drowning was also longlisted for the 2024 Giller Prize, named a Globe and Mail Best Book, and is a finalist for the Rakuten Kobo Emerging Writer Prize and the Jim Davis Prize for Writing That Provokes. Wow, it's a lot.
So we caught up with Loghan about how they're feeling after a whirlwind of praise and acclaim for the book, the journey into writing, and their overall experience at UBC and more.
Let's jump in.
Hi, my name is Loghan Paylor, and I am an author and a teacher and also co-owner of a small business.
It's been an exciting 2026 for you. Not only winning Canada Reads, congratulations, championed by Tegan Quinn, but The Cure for Drowning has been nominated in the speculative fiction category for the 2026 Rakuten Kobo Emerging Writer Prize. What has this first half of 2026 felt like? How are you feeling now?
It's been an absolute whirlwind, a really good whirlwind for sure. It's been exciting and wonderful, but also, just a lot. December 10th of 2025, I had no idea where or how it would feel. But yeah, it's been amazing overall.
You said that your sister helped you a lot with the sudden publicity. Are you an introvert? How has that been like, going on these big interviews and you're like, wow, everyone's watching Canada Reads and I didn't really know about it, but like, oh, okay, great.
Yeah, it was overwhelming. I am an introvert. I'm a pretty private person, like in my personal life. And so that was a pretty big change very suddenly. And, you know, I've done like a lot of teaching and I teach a lot of workshops, and I find that I'm very comfortable like in front of a classroom and sort of in those like scenarios. But yeah, those skills didn't necessarily transfer automatically to big interviews and live radio and all that stuff. My sister was great because, among other things, she actually, I couldn't talk about this while Canada Reads going on. She helped Tegan create a lot of the debate points. She read all the other books and she wrote these like wonderful like little book report summaries for Tegan about, and did some like background research and stuff. So she's really helpful for that. And then also she was just available. I could call her almost every day or text her, and she was just such a good, what did she call herself? She was like, I'm the head of your hype squad. That's my only job, is to just make sure you feel hyped before you do all these things. So yeah, she was amazing. And yeah, and she is an extrovert, so that really helped. There were times when I was like, okay, well, I don't feel capable of doing this, but how would my sister handle this moment? And then I sort of tried to channel her energy.
So if we kind of go back, in 2024, your book was published. It's longlisted for the Giller Prize. There was a bit of a gap. 2 years later, here we are, Canada Reads. And in an era of like instant gratification, of always getting things, that gap for some aspiring writers might feel slow or maybe disheartening at times. What has that gap been like?
So interesting that you label it as a gap, because I'll be honest, like for me, it did not it didn't feel like a gap because that space, like it was so full of other things. So, the book took me like 6 years to write. And so having the book come out in January 2024 was really like the culmination of a lot of smaller steps along the way, a lot of work and team effort on the part of my publisher. And then between the Giller nomination and then everything with Canada Reads, I mean, that whole time for me was full of other writing and teaching and running a business and doing workshops, right? So, perhaps for other writers, it would feel like a gap, but I'll be honest, I wasn't even really paying attention to award season because I had so many other pieces of my life that were on the go.
And when you think back, I mean, obviously 6 years, first of all, what a labor of love to write a novel. Is there, even now looking back, a passage or an excerpt or an element even of the novel that you particularly feel close to or that you often return to?
It's a really good question. There's several parts of the novel that are quite close to my heart. In terms of, from a technical standpoint, at the very end of part 2, there's a particular chapter that I spent a lot of time on because there were some things I wanted to pull off very specifically that were quite technical and required many, many drafts. Like I'm going to guess like upwards of 15 before it was finished. And that passage I do return to because I'm particularly proud of it. Like it's a real testament to, that, as you were saying earlier, like the long progress and kind of putting in the hours. It was nice to see it kind of slowly polish and take its final shape. And in terms of sort of my favorite scenes, they're towards the end of the novel. Some of my favorite ones to write are in kind of the very last couple of chapters, simply because, I'd spent all this time with my characters and kind of the emotional notes and resolutions to their arcs that happen in the last part of the book felt very satisfying. They were happy and I was happy for them.
So as I was kind of digging through old interviews, I heard that part of your writing process for this novel, Post-it notes. What's that about?
This is everyone's favorite interview question. Yes. So I am not the kind of writer who can kind of start at the beginning and write straight through to the end. I know that there are many artists who can, but I am not among them. For me, books and stories come together more like jigsaw puzzles. So I write them very sort of scattershot with little pieces of dialogue and scenes and so on that just kind of pop up. So my earliest drafting, like rough drafting phase, is more about sort of catching all of those little pieces and getting them into one place. And I tried for years with like notebooks and Word doc programs on my laptop, and it didn't work because I would have these ideas come to me at the most inconvenient times. And so after a while, I started just carrying around a pack of sticky notes because they were easy to keep in my pocket. And then if I had an idea, I could just pull them out and write it down and just stuff it in my pocket. And at the end of the day, when I came home, I could go to my studio and pull out all these sticky notes, and I just ended up sticking them to a wall. And it really helped in terms of motivation because the more colorful squares of paper that were on the wall, the more progress I was feeling about the project. And then later on, from a kind of more practical standpoint, when I had a much more substantial draft of the book, like we're talking drafts like 3 or 4, because I had 2 narrators throughout the story, there was a lot of chronological technical things to keep straight. So I would write out scenes on these sticky notes, and I used those to help me plot out the structure and the chronological order of events in the book, because that changed quite a bit throughout the drafting process. So yeah, my budget for sticky notes was quite large compared to other things.
Is your creative process, like, does it vary from writing project to writing project? Like, how do you approach each project and what do different things bring out of you?
It definitely varies project to project and certainly genre to genre. Yeah, I wish I could give you a sort of like a starting point, but every project seems to kind of teach me how to write it. And so at this point, sometimes it's through going on a walk and sort of audio dictation into a note to text app in my phone. Other times it is writing longhand drafts and notebooks. And very occasionally, if the stars align, I can just kind of sit down on my computer and like bash out a second draft relatively quickly. But I think that only happens after I've spent a lot of time doing things that don't look at all like writing, because I'm kind of drafting and like doing revisions and creating it in my head first. So then by the time it reaches the computer, it's a little bit further along. So yeah, I realize that's a very unhelpful answer, but it's different every time.
Do you have any, I guess, words of wisdom to share for writers who are still discovering their creative process and still discovering the rhythm? Like anything that's been helpful for you as you navigate that in your projects?
Sure. Yeah. I think there's a lot of stuff on social media around creativity, specifically writing, that tends to focus a lot on the aesthetics. So there's this idea that, perfect inspiration, a notebook and a beautiful pen and, a very strict routine that you follow in quiet mornings and so on. And there are some artists for whom that works brilliantly, and that's fantastic for them. And if that works for you, then absolutely do it. And I think there's also plenty of writers like me who spent years trying to follow that kind of routine and feeling frustrated when it didn't work for them. I do find writing very difficult. Every day, I am the only person standing between me and creating something. And I am both my own worst boss and worst coworker. It's truly terrible, and I can't fire anyone. So that struggle for me is real and it is difficult. But I've heard a lot of other people talk about like the label of writer is very challenging. It's a very loaded term and so on. And I don't know, I feel like I got all the other hangups and anxieties, and that was just the one that skipped me, possibly because I was such a nerdy, obnoxious kid in school. And so other people started applying the term writer to me really before I had any real conception of what that meant or any of the other sort of loaded emotional terms that would come with that. I think I just managed to dodge it by luck more than anything. And so I guess my advice would be to not worry about how it looks to other people. And if your process is messy and chaotic, then just embrace the mess and the chaos, because that is where you're going to find your best ideas. And writing is already hard, and it only makes it harder if you're sort of fighting yourself every step of the way as well.
It's like all my best ideas come out when I'm in the shower.
They do make a waterproof magnetic notepads and pens to put in showers for exactly that reason. Ask me how I know.
How I feel like this is like a personal journey that you've had. Speaking of writing process, I did my undergrad in English, and I did a course where we had to write, and everyone I met in my program was like, I have like 7 manuscripts that I haven't finished, and it's just in my folder. And truth be told, I also have many unfinished writing pieces. I'm curious, as a professional, is there a folder in your computer somewhere that you have hidden away that has old documents that you're like, I know it's there and I want to work on it, but I just can't. And it's just going to stay there.
Oh, like 1,000%. I think I have one folder per year of my life. Yeah, I have a whole novel that I wrote when I was much younger, in my late teens, early 20s, that just, I've heard other people refer to it as a drawer novel, but it just lives in a drawer. It'll never get published, but I did write it beginning to end, and that was its own achievement. So the short answer is yes, definitely have those folders.
Do you clean them up every year where you're like, I should maybe clear up my storage?
No. Maybe I should. Maybe I should, but it's a cautionary tale. So I am tempted, because I try to be pretty mindful of not like having endless storage in other places in my life. But in The Cure for Drowning, the selkie legend that comes back 3 times, I wrote the very, very first earliest version of just that probably 8 or 9 years before I started working on the actual novel. And when I started working on The Cure for Drowning, I was like noodling along in very early draft stage. And then I was like, wait, why does this feel familiar? I feel like I wrote something kind of about this. And I went back and I dug through all of those years of folders, and I actually found it. And it wasn't good by any standard. It was really terrible. But the bare bones were there. And so that made it into the novel. So unfortunately, I took the wrong lesson away from that. And so now I will like never delete anything on my computer ever again, just in case.
That's amazing. I love it. I mean, and that's why you got to keep buying those hard drives. Got to keep people's business.
Yeah, someone's got to keep Best Buy in business, right? If not us, then who?
Great. Kylie, did you want to have a question? I know you want one.
So like, I'm so curious then about this process. Like the selkie piece was there. When did these characters first come to you? Like, was there one character that came to you first that was in your mind for a long time, or?
The first character that really showed up was kids, because they are loud and opinionated and have some very clearly drawn motivations throughout the whole book. So they showed up first. And the very earliest drafts that I was noodling around with were only from kids' perspective. So this started out as a single POV book. And then the further I wrote into it, the more I was like, well, if I'm going to write a kind of unreliable narrator with a reputation for telling tall tales, then I do kind of need like another character to provide some reflections of reality into this. And so I noodled around with a few options, but then kind of the further it went, especially once I realized it was going to be like a romance story as well, I thought, I did not want Rebecca to become just this like object of someone's affections. And she was, very much her own character in her own right. And writing her perspective was really fun, because it took a little bit longer to sort of find her voice. But once I did, I was pleasantly surprised of, you are just as equally opinionated and have just as much agency and so on as Kit does. But also, it was really important to me that if I was going to write a gender non-conforming character like Kit, then I also needed someone to be kind of a loving witness to the truth of their identity, especially since I knew this book was going to be marketed outside of like the queer and trans community.
You mentioned nature walks, I assume in the Fraser Valley, but the novel itself is set in Ontario. And I know you were born in Ontario, but could you describe what the journey back to your home province was like, fictionally or metaphorically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly the landscapes between BC and Ontario are very, very different. So I grew up in Ontario. I spent the first 18 years of my life living there. And my parents have a hobby farm in Southwest Ontario. So I grew up with a lot of freedom to kind of roam around in this rural area. It's not exactly where I set the novel. The novel is set further north of Toronto, where my dad's family is from. But certainly as a kid and as a teenager, I spent way too much time unsupervised, just sort of roaming around, getting into trouble. And I think, you know, especially at that age, right, a lot of experiences become flashbulb memories. And so I have a lot of very strong sensory memories of what that was like as a child. And so when I set out to write The Cure for Drowning, I knew that I needed a really detailed and grounded setting in order to kind of mix in all the other speculative fiction and fantasy elements I wanted to put in. And that to me just kind of seemed like the most logical choice because it was the place that I personally had the most experience walking around in nature, but also it was the landscape that I knew most intimately. And so as part of the process of writing the book, I went back and looked at a lot of photos that I'd taken as a kid. I did go back and visit my parents at least once. It was during the pandemic, so that made it a little more challenging. But yeah, it was fascinating to go back and then retrace those walks that I went on as a child and see the things that were exactly the way I remembered them and the things that were just had completely changed, of course, in 15 years.
As I was reading the book, I was like, I just know that this author has lived in Ontario. I'm in Toronto. I grew up in Hamilton. And so I just know that this person knows Southern Ontario. It was so intimate. It was so Canadiana.
It was also the results, like one of the kind of weaknesses of memory too, is that later on working with my editor, I got so many line edits back about, oh, this is the wrong kind of wildflower. This tree would never grow in Ontario. You know, turkey vultures were not introduced into Ontario until after this date. You got to pick another bird, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, thank you. Part of it came from my childhood memories, and then a lot of it came from some very hardworking copy edits.
You talk about the role nature had in your writing process. I'm curious what your feelings are as a writer who's found comfort and inspiration in nature. Watch the ways that maybe governments and policies are kind of not doing great things to nature via the climate crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can sum it up with sort of rage and despair. Yeah, as someone who spent a lot of time in natural spaces and really values the natural world, and I feel like the more time you spend out in nature, the more it becomes less of like a monolith abstract. When people talk about it, it's not just nature with a capital N. It becomes like, oh, the pond that is at the park near your house where the same pair of birds nest every day, right? So it becomes more personal. And yeah, like many people, I think I struggle to not only understand the level of kind of corporate and political greed that drives so much of this destruction, and that balanced against the sort of almost overwhelming sense of despair at being unable to stop it. So yeah, if anyone has figured out the secret passcode that's going to fix this for us, I'd love to hear it.
Switching gears a little bit, I wanted to ask about some of your other endeavors. So in addition to being a writer, you're also the co-founder and co-owner of a gaming company, Bookworm Games. How has the diversity of your interests affected your writing process or thinking? And what role does professional endeavor play in your life?
Yeah, it's been, I would say, 80% supportive and 20% difficult because they are such different worlds to be in. But I think I am very grateful, to be honest, because I think in a lot of professional creative fields, it can start to feel a bit like a sealed bubble, especially in CanLit, where the professional world is quite small. And for me, it has been really nice to have another whole section of my life. I mean, it overlaps a little bit, but it doesn't have a lot of crossover with Book World. And so it really just gives me an excuse to, if I'm stuck on a project or feeling that there's a lot of drama going on that I don't want to be a part of, it's great to be able to sort of step over into the business world where none of that is happening and have the most productive procrastination excuse possible.
Does that differentiation in your writing process help with your kind of imagination and thinking? I feel like a lot of times when I was growing up, people were like, you can't just stare at a window, you're not being productive. But at times, like when I was daydreaming, that was when I had kind of the most chaotic thoughts. So I guess, is that something that you've experienced?
Yeah, I would say my brain definitely thrives on new experiences and novelty. And one aspect of my business is that we don't have a brick and mortar shop or a pop-up company. So I have traveled all over Western Canada to different comic conventions and fan expos, but that means a lot of travel time in between, which is great for staring out windows and daydreaming. And then also, yeah, as part of the business, I've met so many people from very different walks of life and different interests and so on. And I think that also kind of keeps the well of inspiration filled on a regular basis. So yeah, it's been nice to have that balance for sure.
We hear time and time again that strong writers should be strong readers and should be indulging their reading interests voraciously. Are there any writers that come to mind that have inspired your writing style, maybe particularly when building out for Drowning? Are there any Canadian writers that come to mind particularly?
Several of my big inspirations have been writers like Emma Donoghue and Anne Marie MacDonald. They were certainly big inspirations for The Cure for Drowning, and also books like Atonement by Ian McEwan and Sarah Waters' queer historical writing had a big influence on me as a teenager as well. I'm a huge Ursula K. Le Guin fan. I think that I love her speculative fiction, but also her essays on writing and the craft of writing. I first encountered them when I was in undergrad, and they really shaped my view on writing as an artistic medium in ways that I think were very helpful. But yeah, beyond that, I feel like I read voraciously and from a whole bunch of different genres, many of which have nothing to do with historical fiction or magic realism and stuff like that. So it's a wide variety.
So we are an alumni podcast, and you went through the creative writing program at UBC. In what ways did attending that program maybe change your understanding of what being a writer is or impact it?
Yeah, so I did my Master of Fine Arts in the School of Creative Writing, and it was an incredible experience. I did the on-campus program, despite living in Abbotsford at the time, so I was commuting in several days a week for classes and then for TAing and so on. And it was a fantastic experience. I think it was really critical to my development as an artist and also my sort of understanding of just kind of crossing that threshold from writing is something that I am passionate about doing and it is a hobby that I have always enjoyed and so on, into the idea that, okay, how do I conduct myself as a professional creative artist? You know, what are the other skills that are required to be in this world and succeed in this career beyond simply putting words on a page? And I mean, the faculty in that school are incredible. I had so many amazing mentors and writers who I think otherwise I would not have had the chance to meet or to necessarily learn from in the same way. And so, yeah, despite the long hours of commuting, I really kind of committed myself to kind of diving full into the program and trying to take advantage of every opportunity, whether that was readings or guest lectures or other things that were happening. And yeah, it was absolutely crucial to my career for sure. I get a lot of questions from people about whether or not they should apply for an MFA, both readers, but also...
Do tell.
I think it's a very common question, right? Because it's a big investment of time, of energy, of money, certainly. The program is 2 years long, but for many people, it takes longer. And so it does require kind of putting potentially other aspects of your life on hold in order to fully dedicate yourself. And I think that there is a lot of value in MFA programs, and they are also not the only path to writing professionally. And so I get this question a lot doing readings and events and stuff like that. And usually what I tell people is the MFA is a big commitment. So my advice is to start somewhere smaller. Try one of UBC's extended learning courses, go and do a 2-day writing retreat somewhere in Canada. Both the financial outlay and the time outlay are going to be much, much lower for you. And just go and see how you feel. Because if you get a few weeks into an extended learning program and are getting nothing out of it, then, you know, that's important information to have about your learning style and what you need to thrive in a community versus a retreat and so on. So yeah, I think often MFAs are sort of held up as like the pinnacle of professional writing training. And I don't think that's necessarily true. They are simply one path to reach that may or may not be the correct fit for you.
Firstly, an Abbotsford commute is hardcore. I commuted from Surrey and that felt awful. So respect. That is great timing as someone who's kind of for the last 2 years been like, do I go to grad school or do I
The answer is no.
like, I know. And then everyone I talk to, including Carol, will be like, I don't know. Do you really feel like you need to? But it's the thing that gnaws at. I think a lot of people are like, it's there. Should I just do it? Of course, that's not to say that there's not, like you said, a lot of value in pursuing those pathways if that's something that is, if it works for you and is accessible to you. Do you have any final words of wisdom for folks who maybe are in that program and like it might be a bit of a bleak landscape and are trying to imagine a path forward for themselves as creatives?
That's a tough question because I do feel like the world has changed very rapidly, even in the 6 years since I graduated. And so I'm hesitant to provide any kind of pat advice because I'm worried it will just sound very facile. I will say that, yeah, as an adjunct prof, I worry about similar things for my students, especially with an encroachment of AI into creative spaces and all of that nonsense. I think my best advice would be that if you come into writing and your only goal is publishing and fame and fortune, you're kind of setting yourself up for disappointment because it is a long road and the opportunities are small. And if that is your only measurement of success, it just statistically, you are more likely to be disappointed than not. So my advice would be to find something else that is your driving passion in writing. And whether that's feeling like you have a story inside of you that simply needs to be expressed, that's wonderful. If it's writing something that will connect with a reader, creating art that will connect people to each other or connect them to your experience, that is very helpful. If your goal is to truly be a part of the artistic community and be a member of kind of a writing collective, then those are all goals that you can achieve regardless of AI, regardless of anything else that's happening in the world. And I think that more than ever, that is important to kind of understand what your personal motivation is, because that will give you the stamina and the ability to keep going in the face of everything that the world is currently throwing at creatives.
So with that being said, do you feel more prepared or do you feel more excited about possibly doing another big national thing where people are like, we want to interview you. We have questions. We need to talk to you all the time.
I actually don't know. Is that what happens with the Rakuten Kobo?
I'm assuming.
Okay.
I mean, emerging writer, Kobo, Canadian? I don't know.
Yeah, fair. So the thing is, I didn't find out about that from my publicity team. I found out about that from Google Cards the other morning. And so I emailed my publicist and I was like, is this real? Is this someone? And she was like, oh yeah, no, I meant to email you. Sorry. Yeah, you're on the... And I was like, okay, this is how I find out things about my career now. So yeah, we'll see. I guess I'll take this week to try and recoup and then whatever June 17th brings, just be prepared to meet it.
I feel like at this point you need to have, Google Alerts for your name to just be in the know.
See, because Google Alerts, it's not just CBC, it's also Reddit. And yeah, I get enough hate mail. It's okay. I don't need to.
I am one of those weird people that emails authors when I read their book and I'm like, oh my God, you've changed my life. And I'm sure like they get so many of those. But is there one that recently or not recent that has kind of stuck with you?
There are a few. I mean, I get lovely messages from readers, absolutely. And I really treasure every single one. There's a couple that have stuck out. So one was from a couple years ago now. It was closer to when the book was first published, but I got an email from a gentleman on the East Coast who was in his, I believe, like mid-70s. And he wrote and he told me that I picked up your book because it was about World War II and I like reading books about World War II. But then I kept reading it and I liked it more than I expected to. And then he went on to say, I didn't know very much about the queer trans community, but now my grandchild just came out as non-binary a few months ago. And now that I've read your book, I feel like I understand them a little bit better. And we've been able to kind of like repair our relationship. And I was just like bawling reading this email. So that was really lovely. I've had messages from readers saying, this one was fairly recently, like in the last couple months, she was telling me that her partner just came out as non-binary. And so the letter writer, had read my book and really enjoyed it and then had been kind of pestering her partner to read it for like several months. And then when they finally did, then that kind of became, how did she describe it? She was like, it became a kind of common ground and it gave them like shared language to talk about like their partner's experience and what they needed and stuff. And that also made me cry. There have been some really good ones. It feels very surreal because I know that there have been books like that in my life. So yeah, the idea that I have now created something that does that for other people. It doesn't quite feel real, to be honest. I'm still like, I think you might all be fibbing. I think this is just all one big hoax on me. Thank you for writing me all of these nice lies.
There was a debate on Book Talk about book reviews are kind of meant for readers, not so much authors. Do you dabble in people's reviews, or are you like, that is a space that's not for me?
I, as a rule, do not read reviews because I believe very strongly that spaces like Storygraph and Goodreads, those are reader spaces, and readers need space to talk about artistic work and have discussions about books without worrying about hurting writers' feelings and so on. So there's that aspect of it. And then also, I know myself, and I don't think that I would be able to continue creating if I also read every review that came out. I just get so swept up in other people's opinions that I would kind of lose track of my own voice. So I avoid them out of respect for readers and then also kind of for my own self-preservation.
Well, thank you so much. And again, congratulations on all of the awards. I'm sure 2026 will continue to be chaotic. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. It's been great.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful.
Jeevan, you are a writer. What did you make of that conversation? The advice that Loghan had, the wisdom of maybe not doing writing full time for fame and fortune?
I felt like there were just so many gems in that conversation. Loghan shared so much with us about how non-linear writing as a process can be, which I thought was really fun, and how varied processes can be, which as a very different kind of writer, so much of what they shared resonated. I have a process, but it also varies from project to project and depending on how much background knowledge I have. But I think the general idea of you got to do it for the love of the game if you want to be happy for a long time holds up pretty well, because it's a tough industry. And as someone who has stepped away from full-time journalism, what did you make of that conversation?
It was really nice to hear an author talk about how, like, it's not all fun and games, and that staring at pen and paper or your Word document is actually the most miserable time sometimes, because you're like, brain, think of words, think of ideas. But I really liked that they talked about going out and being so-called distracted and daydream, because often that's where the best ideas come from. I mean, for me personally, this might be TMI, not all of the best ideas come from the shower. Those often happen when I'm on the toilet. You know, you just gotta let your mind wander and allow your brain to be bored to curate some imagination, which was great. And I do have to wonder, Jeevan, are you gonna maybe like dabble into writing a book after having this conversation with Loghan? I feel like that's in your future.
Wow, big questions. I have always wanted to write a book, but I've always thought it's got to be the right thing. I do definitely feel super inspired after talking to Loghan, because they were just so cool, and you could tell how much they love their craft. Even just listening to their process, like 6 years writing The Cure for Drowning is crazy. And the amount of detail that went into making sure it felt historically accurate and lived in. Yeah, it was definitely inspiring. So stay tuned. Maybe a From Here Forward book coming in the future.
I would like a signed copy if that happens in the next 5 years. If it's in the next 10, I'm not really interested.
Fair, very fair.
Well, thanks everyone for listening. If you have a great book recommendation, please email us, let us know. And yeah, you can catch our next episode by subscribing or following our show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you are feeling your feels, please drop us a review. You can find me on Carol Eugene Park.
And me on Twitter at Jeevan K. Sangha. From Here Forward is an alumni UBC podcast produced by Kylie McFedrin for Podium Podcast Company.